I'd say the best part about being a technical designer is when you can come up with a really cool idea and you also have the skills and the knowledge to actually make that idea a reality. Take one game I worked on, for example, it was a top down shooter called Flux Firefight, and we wanted it to be roguelike-y and have a lot of different weapons, and I was in charge of the weapons design. So I sat down and we started thinking about what sorts of weapons and the motifs we wanted in the game, and we ultimately settled on we wanted everything to be from the 80s, whether it was a film or a game or a book, it didn't matter. So I got thinking about what sorts of iconic weapons from 80s media there were, and one of the things I quickly gravitated towards was the super shotgun from Doom. And what I noticed when I was trying to develop that and get it to work in our game was that from a consumer standpoint, you almost never think about what actually goes into making it work and behave as it does. And for actually having to work on those things myself, I had to sit down and analyze them and figure out exactly how they worked so I could properly recreate them. So for the super shotgun, it was just studying the timing and creating a basic system to where you could fire your gun and it would automatically load itself and it would feel like the super shotgun. Another more complicated example is the smart gun for the same game. We based it off that really fancy machine gun from the Alien franchise, specifically Aliens, the second film. There's some really cool infrared targeting auto aiming gun that we wanted to have in our game. Of course, it being a top down shooter that involved some interesting hurdles. I had to think about how to properly convert a first person shooter weapon into a top down shooter weapon and get it to actually feel good. And the end result was something very satisfying. It was a gun where you moved the box around and it would always fire at the closest enemy to you, and you could very precisely choose which enemies you wanted to hit, or you could just kind of wave the box all over the place and hit people. There were a couple other power-ups I was particularly happy with in Flux Firefight. Since everything was from the 80s, we wanted everything to be retro-futuristic, and that demanded some form of slow-mo. We didn't want it to be cliched or on demand like it was in something like Max Payne, so we made the time paradox gloves, which slow down time for the duration of your reload, and that would give you time to evaluate your situation and think about what you wanted to do next. Going back to the Alien franchise, or in this case Predator, we wanted to have some sort of passive pet turret thing that would follow you around and help you out. And we ended up making the plasma caster that the Predator has and integrating all the cool sound effects and the proper timing and the particles to actually have it feel like you had this Predator cannon that was helping you through the level. One of my first projects at FIA was recreating something to do with Minecraft. We were given a Perlin noise algorithm that generated a bunch of random blocks in a somewhat orderly manner, and we were just said to go do something with these blocks. And I sought to, as accurately as possible, recreate the original game, not having played it before. So I did my research and looked into how the digging and the block placing felt and got those features into the game first. You can dig down to the bedrock and actually put the blocks where you want, exactly how it is in Minecraft. You have a raycasting system where you look at the face of each block and then you get its local forward and then you put the block one unit over on that face. So regardless of where you're looking, the block will always go where you want it to. I really enjoyed implementing that gameplay, but I was really frustrated with how the performance was. We were dealing with a 64 by 64 by 12 grid of blocks, and each having one of those be a game object, things were lagging immensely when you got into making larger objects. So I decided to get my feet wet with systems design and programming, and I wanted to make occlusion culling for my Minecraft game. We were doing this in Unity, but Unity's occlusion culling wasn't working nearly how I wanted it to. Instead, I did the research and figured out how it works, and based on how I was keeping track of all the blocks, you'd load them into a 3D array, and then you could actually have the blocks be aware of their blocks above and to the sides and below them, and those blocks would check and see if they could possibly be seen by the player, and if not, then they would turn off their mesh renderers. That immensely helped the frame rate of the game and actually made it quite enjoyable. In the last stages, I was playing on it and I was just making a castle, and someone walked by and said, "Why are you playing Minecraft? Aren't you working on your final?" And I'm like, "This is my final." One thing I learned on Flux Firefight, being the only programmer, was the importance of having a modular and easy to change and expand upon system. Seeing as we were working from scratch, I needed to build out all of the systems for the power-ups and the weapons in the inventory and how the player controller handles those weapons and which ones are active and so forth. I got to the point where things were modular enough and the inheritance structure worked where I had a base weapon and all you had to do was plug in new projectiles or slightly rewrite the fire behavior. If you wanted the super shotgun, you'd pull the trigger, it would fire twice in a brief delay and then automatically reload itself versus a normal gun, which was just one shot, one click. And things got to be working very well. It got to the point where it was very satisfying to sit back and see the system and explain to other people how it worked, and they could easily work upon the work that I had started. Though a modular system isn't always the desired way to do things, particularly for Flux's event scripting, there needed to be a number of very specialized scripts to handle very specialized actions. We wanted some set pieces in the game, because any sort of shooter isn't complete without set pieces, and we wanted to have a generator room. So we didn't really have anything planned for that, so I started fiddling around with sound effects and getting some programmer animation, just having things spin and spin faster. And eventually we got the big generator event with the music transition, and I just sat there once it was done in my testing space, and I was like, ugh. The same thing goes for our final fight for our Flux demo level. We were defending the bridge while a self-destruct timer was counting down as you got attacked by increasing waves of enemies. And it felt chaotic. There was a bunch of enemies and you had limited ammo and you had to not get killed, but there just wasn't something there. So I got to coming up with the system to have strobe lights flashing and sounds to accompany it as the countdown was counting down. We actually found the audio clip from the self-destruct ship in the very first Alien film and synced that up with our timer for our game. And we also added a bunch of periodic random explosions that would leave particle fires behind, and the end result was something spectacular.
Danger. The emergency destruct system is now activated. The ship will detonate in T-minus.
I'd always been fascinated with audio, and not just in games, with audio in general. I was a musician in high school and for a couple years of undergrad, and whenever there was an option for audio in a game, I always wanted to be a part of it. At first, that started with just editing sound effects, pulling them off the internet occasionally, making my own, or even doing some voice acting. Eventually, it turned into actually scripting audio, implementing the sounds, and then at the later stages, actually programming my own audio systems just because I wasn't satisfied with the ones that I had available to me. In Unity in particular, their audio source system is great, but it doesn't have a lot of support for anything like crossfades or scripting 3D sounds, actually changing the spatial blending settings within a script. You are only ever able to do those things to an audio source component, and that can't be changed at runtime or with an event. There are also things like copying sounds or properly handing 2D sounds that you want to loop via a script. And I sat down and expanded upon their audio source system and created our own audio framework that I started for in Flux Firefight to get the audio for an action game properly sounding in 3D space. And that eventually came over into the Logician, where we got tremendous use out of the crossfades and the 3D sounds to get the farm and the music sounding great. One particular issue with the Logician was of just how many sound effects we had. I think halfway through development we were around the 200 mark, and there was no good place to actually put all of those clips so we could refer to them in one place. So what we ended up doing was devising a system within the Audio Manager where you'd load every WAV file from a resources folder, and then you'd put those all into a list, and then you would parse through the WAV file names and create strings that cut off the naming convention. And then you would load those strings and those WAV files into a dictionary. And then from your audio manager, which you could call anywhere in the code base, you could just do audio manager dot play sound, and then in quotes you'd provide the string name for the audio clip. Probably the most computer sciencey thing I'd ever done, both like literally and figuratively, was the Logician's fishing minigame. Just a quick refresher, the Logician is a farming game that teaches kids how to program, and we wanted the fishing game to have some way incorporated programming logic so it could actually be of educational value. So what we wanted to do was have the fishing game teach kids how to evaluate logical statements and or statements with greater than, less than, equal to, and so forth. And we wanted to do that with fish. So we would randomly generate a fish, which is a collection of sprites, and we were able to generate these logic questions. So it could ask you, is the fish red, or is it striped, or is it blue and spotted? And the player would answer true or false, and they'd have to get a number of those questions correct to catch the fish. And I was in charge of programming that by myself. It was my pet project. And though a mini game may sound something simple, it is a completely self-contained game. It needed its framework built up from scratch. At some point, I needed to make a custom data type or two, some fancy multi-sprite object so you could actually display things on the fish, and that would actually pare down to with the abstracted symbols you saw on the user interface. And also scripting all of the systems in the event flow to get everything working nicely and so it actually felt good to play. All in all, my journey as a technical designer has been immensely satisfying. There's been so many cool projects I've been a part of and I got to contribute to, both in a design sense and in an actual concrete programming sense. It's always nice to be the guy who comes up with the cool idea that everyone likes, but it's just as satisfying being able to actually make that a reality, and you can look at what's working on screen and think to yourself, I did this.